So, time then for the press preview. We're about to take a look at Monday's front pages, and tonight we'll check out the headlines with the economics editor at The Spectator, Kate Andrews, and journalist and author Rachel Shabi. Good to see you both. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at some of those front pages for you. Why don't we begin with the Metro leading on Boris Johnson's claims that he has a 50-page dossier that will clear him of any wrongdoing with regards to partygate. Same story on the front of the Eye. It says Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has postponed the announcement of several key policies because of the publication of the documents. The Times says an independent report due to be released tomorrow will reveal that the Met police force faces being broken up if it doesn't rapidly overhaul its toxic culture. UBS has agreed to buy Credit Suisse for $3.25 billion as regulators attempt to prevent the collapse of the Swiss banking system. It's the lead in the FT. According to The Guardian, health unions are preparing their nurses to return to strike action, with voting on the 5% pay rise offer on a knife edge. The Daily Express says European judges are on the brink of backing down over their ruling, preventing asylum seekers being sent to Rwanda. That story also leading the Daily Mail, along with a new picture of the Princess of Wales with her 3 children released for Mother's Day. And the Star warns that Britain is set to face a polar plunge, with temperatures dropping to -9 in some places and snow forecast. And don't forget, you can scan the QR code that you see on screen during the programme. Check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And to discuss them, I'm joined tonight by the economics editor at The Spectator, Kate Andrews, and journalist and author Rachel Shabi. Very nice to see you both this Mother's Day. Thanks for taking the time this evening. And let's get cracking, shall we? Starting, Rachel, with the front of the Metro, their headline, Boris's deadly dossier. We're going to hear his defence tomorrow. It's a 50-page file, and he's going to rely on these WhatsApp messages. Just explain more.
Apparently he is. I have to say, I think that's a very unfortunate headline, given how deadly things were at the time when all these parties were going on at Downing Street and everyone else was under strict lockdown measures. But yes, Boris Johnson says he has this 50-page dossier that will prove once and for all conclusively that he didn't know and that he didn't mislead Parliament when he said that no regulations were broken once it was revealed that all those parties were going on in Downing Street, as I say, around that time when the rest of us were under the strictest lockdown measures. So this is ahead of the parliamentary committee, which is looking into the lockdown breaches, which is meeting on Wednesday. And it's expected to have a 4-hour televised meeting where Boris Johnson will be appearing and have to answer their questions. Whenever this comes up, I mean, I do think instantly of all the families who lost loved ones at this time and what this must be like to have that constantly come up with Boris Johnson making these claims. And I also think about all those whistleblowers, actually, who were so discomforted and so unnerved and unsettled by what was going on, as they claim in Downing Street, that they felt they had to speak out. It does seem like there's a lot of evidence, both from those whistleblowers, but also actual pictures suggesting that he was aware those measures were breached. But as we say, he's got this dossier and he's going to present it to the committee on Wednesday.
Yeah, Rachel, very quickly, before we get Kate's thoughts on this, which way do you think it's going to go this week for Boris Johnson?
I mean, Boris Johnson, people who are at one of the parties said that he was overheard saying that it was the UK's most unsocially distanced party, right? That's what he said. There are pictures of him standing in very crowded gatherings with booze strewn about. It sort of beggars belief that he wants us to think that he didn't know when he's saying things like that and when there are pictures of him doing things like that. So I hope it doesn't go well for him.
OK, well, the front of the Eye says it's going to be a crunch week, Kate, for Boris Johnson, his spokesperson is saying the evidence will show that he did not knowingly mislead Parliament. What are your thoughts on all of this?
So the really important question here is not whether or not partygate happened. As Rachel says, we have photos. We have many photos at this point. Fines have been issued. We know that partying was taking place inside Downing Street when it was illegal for the rest of us to, at points, even be, sitting on a park bench together or certainly having friends and family into our home. The question is whether or not Boris misled the House of Commons. And this argument that he's going to fight may be made on a very technical point. And the front of the papers are suggesting that he's going to claim that it was, the language and it was the advice of people that he claims were very senior around him that were suggesting to the language that he ended up using in the House of Commons. That may end up being a technical argument. And of course, Boris Johnson is going to want to use the politics around this, most notably Sue Gray, who originally oversaw the Partygate report, now planning to go work for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. He's going to want to build up that narrative, as are his supporters, that this whole thing is unfair from the start. But the big question isn't whether or not it happened. We know it did. It's whether or not he misled Parliament. And if he is found guilty of doing so, he's in political trouble. If they want to suspend him and there's a vote in the House of Commons, Rishi Sunak has already said that he'll give a free vote on that so people can use their conscience to vote for that. Make of that what you will from the current Prime Minister. And also he could even be looking at a recall vote depending on how that suspension played out and what that finding was. So we're kind of at the start of the process now. Depending on what the Privileges Committee decides, there could be a much longer saga that continues on that determines Boris Johnson's political fate.
Yeah, it's going to be quite a week, isn't it? Let's move on to another topic and the Rwanda plan. Rachel, the front of the Daily Express is saying that European judges are on the brink of backing down. This is over their ruling preventing asylum seekers being sent to Rwanda.
Yeah, well, that's what Suella Braverman has revealed last night. So that's off the back of what was a pretty stomach-turning, actually, publicity stunt trip that she took to Rwanda, which her cheerleaders in the right-wing press reported because they were the only ones who were invited to attend with her. And I suspect that this is a way of keeping the story on the front pages for one more day. According to her, the European Court of Human Rights, which you'll recall, they issued injunctions that stopped last summer those planes that were about to deport people who, let's remember, were vulnerable asylum seekers fleeing wars, persecution, and worse. Those planes were grounded because of an injunction from the European Court of Human Rights. She's now saying they might back down. The government wants to put through a bill, the illegal migration bill, that would allow ministers to ignore the court anyway. And so that's the sort of threat they've got hanging over the European Court in Strasbourg. But I guess this is another one of those things where, I'm now saying very sort of boring legal things. What we're talking about are the most vulnerable people on earth, some of them, who we have Suella Braverman dreaming of putting them on a plane and deporting them to Rwanda, when we have a legal duty to process any and all asylum claims made here. But also, what kind of person dreams of that? Why would we want that? And why is it dominating our front pages in this disgusting way?
Kate?
So Rachel makes the important point that this is the perspective of the Home Secretary, who wants her deportation plan to go ahead, and she's saying that progress is being made. If progress were being made with the European Court of Human Rights, I don't actually think that would be the most surprising news in the world, in the sense that there are a lot of people out there, including legal experts, who think that the European Court of Human Rights would be more hesitant to overrule primary legislation from a government, which is what this government is hoping to bring in, rather than try to work with the rules it has now. It made very clear when it brought in this illegal migration bill that the idea was to change legislation so that would stop happening. I mean, I very much agree with Rachel's sentiment about the ethics around this. But in terms of what might actually be overruled, I think the bigger question around this is the practicality of it. It is still completely unclear if a country like Rwanda will take more than a few hundred people. It remains very unclear, given how broken the UK asylum system is currently, whether or not the government is in any position to process people within 28 days and deport them. And what's going to happen, practically speaking, when it is clear that people are showing up from war-torn countries afraid for their lives, and we're trying to put them on planes to a third country. A lot of practical questions, in my opinion, alongside the technical legal ones.
OK, all right, listen, I'm just going to get one more story in before the break, and it's our lead story tonight. UBS acquiring Credit Suisse. Rachel, the bank is 167 years old. It's one of 30 main global banks, and it was vital that some sort of rescue deal was done, wasn't it?
Well, apparently it was also vital. So they were rescued in this emergency £2 billion deal, as you've been reporting this evening, and for the reasons that you just stated, because it is one of the world's largest banks. And, you know, there were concerns that the lack of confidence in this bank would have a ripple effect throughout the global banking system. Does kind of make you a bit anxious that this sort of vulnerability is happening all over again. And then we have these sort of massive government-backed bailouts of banks who are considered too big to fail, but, you know, not so long ago failed spectacularly, and we all had to bail them out then. So it does sort of raise an echo. I'm not saying the same thing is going to happen again. I'm just saying it's odd that having happened once, the regulations that are in place aren't sufficient to prevent this happening again.
Yeah, you make a very good point. And Rachel, Credit Suisse has had all sorts of problems, hasn't it, over the last few years? It's got itself into all sorts of hot water, despite lessons that we all learnt after the financial crash.
And that's the concern. It makes you wonder, well, if there were all these regulations put in place after the crash, regulations which, by the way, our own government has a bill going through Parliament now to try and ease. If there were all those regulations in place, why is a bank like Credit Suisse, which is so big, why is it getting itself into such hot water? Why is it, you know, being given a credit line a few weeks ago, but that credit line wasn't enough to stop the damage, to stop its share prices plummeting, to stop that sort of leaching out of any confidence in that bank, resulting in a bailout? It does raise lots of questions about actually, were any of those lessons learned, or are they all now being rapidly forgotten and dumped?
Yeah, we'll get your thoughts, Kate, in the next hour, if that's all right. We're squeezed for time. But be interesting to find out your thoughts and analysis on that. Coming up in a moment, plenty more from the papers, including this story. It's on the front of The Guardian. Their headline, Health Union members in push to reject NHS pay deal. Chatting about that next. Welcome back. Part two of the press preview. Kate and Rachel are still with us. Let's have a look at the front page of The Guardian, Kate. A deal was reached, wasn't it, between union bosses and ministers regarding the NHS pay deal, but it could be undone by this group called NHS Workers Say No. Tell us about this.
It's a cross-union group that's campaigning against the deal that's been struck between ministers and union representatives. That deal, which would see one-off payments, especially for COVID and the efforts done there, given to a range of 6 unions, including the Royal College of Nursing, and then a 5% pay raise from next year, has to be voted on by the members, of course. And this group is saying you should reject it and you should keep up with the strikes. I think the reality, the political reality here, is that the government is adamant that it is not going to give inflation-linked pay raises because they see the headline rate of inflation coming down so rapidly this year. And actually, the information we got from the budget, from the Office for Budget Responsibility, which has one of the most optimistic forecasts for inflation that I've seen, which is that it's going to get very close to the bank's target of 2% by the end of this year, is actually going to empower the government on that position. So it's not going to come close to that 11% mark. It's not planning to do that. The question is whether or not union members decide that this 5% is okay from now on, looking at where that headline inflation rate is expected to go to, or whether or not they're going to campaign for more.
Yeah, Rachel, many members angry that it falls short of that 19% that they were originally demanding. I see The Guardian here has quoted one clinical nurse saying it's an insulting offer. It goes nowhere near what we set out to achieve. Interesting, this tension, isn't it, between the workers and the union leaders?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's worth pointing out about inflation that, the damage has already been done. The prices are not going to come down. And so I guess for these NHS staff, including nurses who, this is like an extraordinary strike. They have never been on strike in their entire history, the Royal College of Nurses. So it shows you how profound the crisis is. And of course, a lot of the nurses being interviewed over the last few weeks have said, look, we don't expect 19%. It's a starting offer, but what they're being offered is nowhere near that starting offer. And what they're worried about is not just the fact that they cannot scrape by on these appalling wages, which is true, and the wages have stagnated for at least a decade, but it's also that they fear that it will affect retention, that staff will continue to leave. There'll continue to be this mass exodus from the NHS, but also it'll be very difficult to recruit new staff as well under such terms. So you can see why they have such concerns, and you can see, if they've made this huge decision reluctantly to go on strike, they're unlikely to settle really for such a paltry offer.
But Kate, do you not think that if you join a union, you have to put your faith in the union leaders to do the right thing on your behalf?
I'm not sure that's the reason every person will be formally signing up to the union. I'm sure there's a lot of range of views amongst members as to what the union reps are actually negotiating. I suspect the union reps have figured out that the government is not going to come close to that 11% target because they are concerned about a wage spiral. They're concerned about the fact that giving that kind of headline inflation pay raise could actually make things worse in the future. Now, we can dispute that, but I think that's very much the government's thinking on the matter. And so they're thinking that 5% might be actually quite a compromise from the government's perspective. At this point, that they've been on strike for months now, on and off. And the question is, how long do you keep doing that, especially with the NHS waiting list as it is at 7.2 million, without, at this point, hundreds of thousands of appointments being cancelled. At some point, you really do have to seriously come to the table. And it seems that the union reps do think this is the moment.